The next step of our Chihuly project is to add all of that bold, beautiful color like Chihuly has in his glass blown pieces. You're gonna need to have some colored pencils. I have a great variety here in the art room, but you could just use regular Crayola colors and those will work just fine. Now, one suggestion I would make, I would set this paper aside. This would actually be like a cool coloring page, or you could turn it into a card for someone. I'd set this aside because it gets a little confusing when you have so many lines. And I would grab just a white piece of paper so that you can see your shapes clearly. Now, I mentioned before the shiny side is for Sharpie. So I need to go ahead and flip this over, and now I'm on the rough side. For this project, I'd like you to try 3 different colored pencil techniques. Now, one you are probably familiar with, and the other 2 may be new learning. I'd like you to practice these on a piece of paper. So if you need to, you can pause the video, and I'd like you to have a piece of white paper with 3 shapes. I just quickly traced circles using my little pot here. You could draw the shapes, but I want you to have a way to practice. We're gonna start with probably the most familiar coloring technique, and that is just coloring solid. This is what you're used to. Here's what I would suggest. You outline the area first, you press hard and color evenly in one direction, and if it's too light, I'll show you how you can repeat the process in the opposite direction. All right, so you saw me color this in, coloring this direction after I outlined, but you'll notice that there's still a bit of Swiss cheese, and I really want some bold, solid color. So what I'm gonna do is rotate my paper, and I'm gonna do the same coloring the opposite direction. This helps to really fill in those little spots of white. So you can see there's some really nice, bold, solid color here, and that is a great technique that you can use on your Shrinky Dink as well. The second thing I'd like to show you is how you blend from one color to another. Now, whenever you do a blended type of All right, so you can see that using that technique really helped create solid, bold color. The next technique I'd like to try is called blending. And this is when you take 2 colors and you blend from one to the next. Now, there's a tip that I'd like to share with you, and that is it is much easier to do blending if you're picking colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. Now, we have a color wheel in our classroom. This is just a smaller version that artists can use to think about colors that they're using for their pieces. You'll notice here, there's a color wheel that you might be familiar with. So I am gonna have much better luck blending if I'm picking colors that are next to each other. So for example, yellow blending into green would be a great option, orange blending into red, blue blending into purple. So I've got 2 colors that I'm hoping to use, green and blue. So I'm gonna still press darkly, but I'm going to lighten up as I get toward kind of the center where these 2 colors are gonna layer on top of each other. So let me go ahead and show you what that looks like. All right, so just to say out loud what I did, I colored this edge of the shape green. I did it pretty solidly until I got to that middle blending zone. Then I lightened up the pressure, which means I wasn't pushing so hard. I was holding my pencil lightly in that zone. Then I did the same thing with the blue, starting with lots of pressure back here to get solid color. And then as I moved again toward that blending zone, not pushing as hard, but lightly coloring in that area. And then you'll notice that I kind of switch back and forth to try and get as smooth of a blending area as I can. So that's how you do blending. All right, the last one is called layering, and this technique works really well for adding texture. And so what I'm gonna do is, maybe I'll switch colors here. Maybe I'll do purple and blue this time. And I'm gonna outline the shape, and I'm gonna color one direction more lightly, like I did with the blending. Then I'm going to switch to the other color, rotate my paper, and I'm gonna go the opposite direction. And you'll see that we're gonna end up with a really cool textured effect. All right, so for this one, you get a less smooth finish, which is why you get a textured feel to it. Sometimes students will ask if they can do a third color, and you could go back in there, and maybe I do this one diagonal to do a third layered color. So feel free to experiment with that technique. All right, so now that we have practiced these three techniques, we're going to switch gears and go ahead and use these techniques on our actual Shrinky Dink. Now, part of your grade is based on the fact that I will see you trying all three of these techniques on your Shrinky Dink. You may discover that some are simpler for you than others, and so you could certainly have more of one than the other, but I should clearly see all three attempted on your Shrinky Dink. So I'm gonna come back here. The colors that you choose are entirely up to you, but the whole thing does need to be colored. One color that students often overlook, but really is amazing, is just white. White ends up being a really nice contrast to some of the bolder colors. So what you would do is begin to color this. You could start with solid areas if that is easier for you. And you're gonna just follow those same techniques and create a really beautiful design. Now you'll notice that when you flip it over, you can kind of see what it's gonna look like just with the plastic. This is also a great way to test and see if you have any Swiss cheese. Now, this process is not a fast process, so you may want to work on this in little bits and pieces. Now, after the whole thing is colored, you are going to bring this to school if you're in rotation A or B, and I am going to help you shrink it. If you are a remote student, there will be additional directions for how to shrink it in your own oven. When you're done, you get something like this. It is the closest we can do to glass blowing in a classroom. You'll see all those bold colors and patterns like Chihuly uses. You'll see interesting line types and contrast with black and white areas and colored areas. So it ends up being a really fun project and a really cool way to make a sculpture.